All right, time to go teach. Hello and welcome to this episode of Tutors, continuing our unit on evolution, and we are looking today at selective pressures. Different things that can cause some alleles to be favored and other alleles to be disfavored. So, targets of the day. First, we are going to define what a gene pool is, and then we are going to compare and contrast different selective pressures between different organisms. And then we are going to describe the different types of selection, of which there are 3. So let us get started. First, natural selection. Remember it from the last episode where we were talking about how nature changes and that caused some alleles to be favored and other alleles not to be favored. The organisms that would survive are called the fittest. They are the ones that are able to pass on their genes to the next generation, whereas the organisms that were not able to survive, they were unfit for their actual environment and they were not able to pass on their genes. That means that we need to look at this thing called a gene pool, which is all of the alleles that exist in a given population. If some organisms don't survive and they don't have offspring that they have passed their alleles to, then that is going to have an effect upon the allele frequency in that specific gene pool. And that is going to cause a change in that gene pool's allele frequency, which means that we have evolution occurring. A change in the allele frequency is evolution. That is how this works. But not all forms of this are going to be equal. There are, as I said earlier, 3 different ways that selection can basically occur. Continuing on with a little overview of natural selection, remember that organisms that outcompete other organisms are going to be the ones that survive. The organisms that are outcompeting other organisms are able to pass on their alleles to the next generation because they are able to reproduce. They have made it. They are the organisms that are surviving and doing well. Organisms that are not able to outcompete other organisms are going to then not be able to pass on their alleles, and their alleles will disappear. As the world around us changes, that means that different traits are going to be favored at different times. Sometimes a trait that is favored at one point in time might be disfavored later on down the road because nature has changed in such a way that that is no longer a trait that gives that organism a competitive advantage. The traits that are favored and the traits that are disfavored change as nature changes. And there are different types of competition between different organisms. The first type that we can talk about is intraspecific competition. That means competition between organisms of the same species. Intraspecific competition would be competition in this case for these plants for sunlight. It would be for water. It would be for nutrients. It would be for the different amount of space that they happen to take up in the soil. They are competing with each other within their grouping. And some of those plants are going to do really well, and some of the other plants aren't going to do as well. Different plants are all competing with each other, and they're all the same species. Each of these plants is going to try to reproduce, but not all of them will be successful in that endeavor. Competition between individuals of the same species, that is intraspecific competition. On the other hand, these plants aren't just going to compete with other plants of the exact same species. They're going to compete with a lot of other plants of many different species, and that's interspecific competition. These different species now competing for the same resources. They're competing for the sunlight, for the nutrients, for the water, and for the space. They're all competing for all these different things, which means that this interspecific competition is competition between individuals of different species. And this is a type of competition that every single organism upon this planet is going to have to deal with. And it's not just necessarily plant to plant, and it's not just necessarily for the same resources. These plants are also competing with the deer and with rabbits to not get eaten. And the deer and the rabbits are competing with each other for food. And we also have wolves, which are competing with the deer and the rabbits for food. The wolves trying to eat the deer or the rabbits. All of these organisms are competing for different things. And that competition is one of the things that will drive evolution. It is one of the factors that will reveal which alleles are favorable and which alleles are not. All based upon which organisms can outcompete the other organisms around them. And that leads us to what are those specific selective pressures that are both interspecific and intraspecific? Well, we have food, the availability or scarcity of those resources, whether it happens to be sunlight for a plant or whether it is the availability of plant life or another organism that heterotroph would happen to consume. Also, the health of organisms. Some organisms are going to be much more susceptible to sickness or injury, and that obviously is disfavorable. We also have predation. Organisms that can evade predators will do better, and organisms that are unable to avoid predators will end up as lunch. It's also dealing with temperature, the weather patterns, what's going on around those organisms, what conditions do they have to deal with? Is it a long, harsh winter? If it is, then that organism must have good enough fat stores or be able to continuously get food throughout that winter. Water. Is the water available in a large amount or is it scarce? And how good is that organism at getting that water? Is it very efficient in its use of water or is it wasteful in its use of water? And mating, specifically the way that these different organisms are going to compete for their mate. Many organisms compete for the opportunity to mate and have offspring with their specific genes. And each of those selective pressures cause a type of selection to occur. There's three types of selection. It is directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. Let's look at directional selection first. If we were to take a graph and we were to look at a specific population, this original population average is where we have the largest area underneath the curve. And most organisms in our population will exist with those specific traits. The trait that would be right in this center area. We would have some organisms that would exist in the extremes, some organisms that are going to exhibit a slightly different trait, but most organisms would be right in this central area. And in directional selection, one of the extremes is going to end up being favored. One of the two extremes is going to end up being more advantageous, which means over time, our population will shift over. It will shift in a direction where average used to be back here, but it has shifted over toward this other extreme. And now we have no organisms in this spot. We have a few at what was the old average, and we have the entire population shifting in a specific direction. This could be a shift toward a color. This could be a shift toward height. This could be a shift in many different directions. But the key is that there is a specific phenotype that is favored, which causes a shift in the population. Because the conditions have changed, the alleles which are favored also change. And that causes our population allelic frequency to shift toward one of the two extremes. And that is directional selection, where one of the extremes is favored. Moving on, we get to stabilizing selection, where again we are looking at our original bell curve with our population, and we are going to look at what happens over time. As conditions change, our population is going to have a narrower bell curve, where the average does better. And the average continues to do better. The extremes do not do as well. The extremes are selected against, but the average is selected for. The average outcompetes the extremes. Those organisms then, over time, the allelic frequency shifts so that even more organisms are in this average area. And that takes us to the next type of selection, which is disruptive selection. And in disruptive selection, instead of one extreme being favored or the average being favored, we are going to end up with both extremes being favored, and the average actually is favored against. The average does not do as well. It ends up going down in its amounts, in its frequency, and we end up with more organisms in the extremes, where those organisms that are at the extremes are able to outcompete the average. That is disruptive selection. So in summary, populations, they're going to experience different pressures. They're going to experience pressures both within their species, intraspecific, and between different species, interspecific. And those different pressures are going to be really important on which organisms are able to outcompete the other organisms around them. The organisms that are able to outcompete the other organisms around them are going to survive and pass on their alleles to the next generation. Those organisms that are unable to do that are going to be unable to pass on their alleles, and those alleles will then disappear. And this type of competition is going to cause for different types of selection to occur. Either directional selection, which will favor one extreme, or stabilizing selection, which will favor the average, or disruptive selection, which will favor two extremes and actually disfavor the average. That's it for this time. Be awesome. Stay awesome.